One of my favorite things at the Ag PhD Field Day is the Brian versus Darren plot. You know, you hear us talk about stuff all around the year, and we finally get to put it in practice and show, all right, well, here's my idea and here's Brian's idea, and most of the time they're fairly similar, but there are some things we like to do a little bit differently. And then to compare that against, what the standard treatments are, what normally is going on in this area and around the country, I think it's pretty interesting. We saw some big differences this year. We're standing in the wheat plot here, and in the wheat especially, Brian, these plots just stood out versus other treatments that were out here at the field day.
One of the big things that both Darren and I did a little different than what most people would do in wheat, and really in any small grain, is we sprayed fungicide 3 times. Now, a lot of people around the country are spraying in their wheat at that herbicide timing, and we think that's a no-brainer. A lot of people are running a half rate. This year on our farm, we did run a full rate just because we had so much moisture and we thought we had just tremendous yield potential. So either half rate or full rate, just depends on your situation, where you're at, disease potential. Okay, so that's pretty much a no-brainer. Almost every wheat farmer in the country is doing that. But what we also did is we sprayed it flag leaf. That's probably the timing that the fewest number of people actually use, but the flag leaf is the most important leaf to protect on that wheat plant if you want top yield. So we sprayed then. We also sprayed at heading timing, certainly to help prevent head scab, but then also for the late season diseases that can roll in, like rust, even stripe rust potentially, because rust will commonly blow up from the southern United States up into the northern part of the country, and it might hit us anywhere from the flag leaf timing to heading timing. We don't know exactly. So just to make sure that we've got great disease protection all season long, not only do we have the seed treatment on there and the early herbicide timing, but we're also spraying at flag leaf and at heading.
And the important thing to remember here is we're focused on return on investment. And you say, well, man, I don't know very many people that do 3 fungicide applications in wheat. Most of the time it's 1, some of the time it's 2, but that 3rd application, is it really going to pay for you? And you just have to think about, well, how much does that really cost? And if you're going to spend, say, $15 an acre making that 3rd application, well, you've got to get 2 or 3 more bushels just to break even. And that's something you have to weigh out for yourself. This year, it's going to easily be that, and it's probably going to be more like 10 or 15 bushels that we're going to gain with that 3rd application. We did have a little bit of head scab come through our area, and when you look, even in the Brian versus Darren plots here where we did those 3 applications, you'll still see a very low level of Fusarium head scab. That stinks that we can't be perfect, but even these great products that we're using, they aren't perfect. They're only going to be 80-90% control, maybe a little bit better. But when you think about that compared to not treating, it's a huge difference, and we aren't going to have any issue marketing the wheat or anything like that. The level of Fusarium in there is so low, it's not going to be even hardly noticeable. But it is definitely noticeable as you walk through the plots and you look where there's only 1 or 2 applications of fungicide made. The wheat here is still, green for another few weeks after the other wheat was ready to harvest.
The other big thing I'd say when we talk about these heading timings the heading timing is there are multiple fungicides you could use. So Prosaro and Caramba, definitely the best on scab, but for only $2 an acre, you can use generic Folicure that's great on rust, but it's only kind of marginal on scab. So there are different levels depending on how severe you think a disease might be.
Well, this gets us back to last year, because last year I decided I'm going to save some money, and I went with Aureus at heading timing because we were dry and we just weren't getting any rain. There wasn't any rain in the forecast. And I thought, I'm going to save the money, and it didn't come back to bite me last year. Now this year I spent more money. I used Caramba. I think Brian used Prosaro in his plot, and we both invested extra money. And it turned out, we had a really wet June, and all of a sudden there was a lot more disease pressure. And it was one of those things where the good thing about fungicides is you don't have to, plan them out 6 months in advance. You can kind of fly, by what the year is bringing you, but you do have to be out there before there's disease. So you can't say, hey, there's head scab now, I'm going to go out and wipe it off my field, like you can with weeds, where you see weeds pop up, you can spray them and know that you did the right thing. You've got to gamble just a little bit ahead. You got to be a week or so ahead of when these problems are going to flare up in your wheat. But that was one thing. The fungicide applications made a big difference. The other thing was fertility. We both spread our fertility out. We put on several doses of fertilizer rather than throwing it all out at once. And I just equate it to this. Let's just say you're planning out your day and you say, I'm going to eat some eggs for breakfast, and I'm going to have a sandwich for lunch, and I'm going to have a steak for supper. Well, if you served all 3 of those things all at 6 a.m., here's all the food you need for the day. How is that going to work out for you? it's not going to work out very well. There's going to be times where you're overfed and can't really deal with it, or your body can't process it. And you're going to have other times where, man, I've kind of burned all that off and now I'm a little bit hungry. We see the same thing in our crops. Whenever we spoon feed our nutrients, it does make a difference, putting low doses out
well,
at the
yeah, but you
timings
can't
that we need
always say that, because the whole thing is, if you're putting fertilizer in the soil, it is getting spoon-fed to some degree when you get moisture. If you're in a dry environment, this is a different deal. So this is where maybe in the dry environment, you want to put it all out in front.
I disagree with that.
This is why we have the Brian versus Darren plots, because even for Darren and me, where we've worked with thousands of farmers all over the world, helping them get higher yields, we still are going to disagree on some of these things because we don't know the weather. My contention is, if I am really in a dry environment,
it's never going to rain again.
Well, hey, on our farm, we've had 3 good weeks of rainfall in the last 2.5 years. That's it. So we just don't know. So this year, we maybe put a little bit more stuff out early because we'd had 2 drought years in a row, hoping that we would get some rainfall. So if you have more consistent rain, I agree with Darren 100%. We want to spoon feed that kind of stuff. And, when we talk about the other plots too, it's not just wheat, but we also did Brian versus Darren in soybeans and in corn. If you look at soybeans, what we do versus what the average farmer does, we're putting a lot more fertility on. We're fertilizing for our soybean crop, and the average farmer in the U.S. is putting very little fertilizer on. So there are just a few things that we try to highlight at our field day that we're doing a little bit different than maybe what the average guy is, and then we're getting a little bit higher yield.
A little bit higher yield?
Well, yeah.
It was significant. You look at last year's yield results, and we don't have all the yield results in yet from this year, but last year's yield results, we were 100 bushels more than what the best farmers are doing around us. And that's not to knock anybody, but when we really focus on trying to get the best yield we possibly can, it's something that every one of us as farmers, do you really think you couldn't have gotten another 10 bushels of corn or 10 bushels of soybeans on your farm if you would have put everything into it? And I know that we all think, oh, we're doing the best that we can. And Brad and I kind of say that to ourselves. Oh, we're doing the best we can. No, we're not. All of a sudden, we took this plot and we said, I'm going to go right against Brian and we're going to show it to thousands of people. Now I'm really concerned about, wow, I really don't want to look bad in this plot. I really don't want to let my brother beat me. I'm going to do everything I can, and I'm really going to focus on, all right, even though I think I need 200 pounds of fertilizer out there, I don't need that all at once. Like in soybeans, you're going to use 90% of that once you get to R2 or R3. So you're in the reproductive stages, you're in full bloom to first pod. Now 90% of your fertilizer uptake comes after that. So why would I put it all out at planting time? I want to space it out a little bit.
Yeah, but here again, it all depends on what you get for rainfall. And the big thing, just a very quick summary of this Brian versus Darren plot area of our field day. The reason why we do this is we try a lot of new things on small scale so you can see what those things look like. And we talk about that, and we're trying to learn all the time from that. And the things that don't work, obviously, we want to pitch those. But the things that do work, we want to take those on a much bigger scale to our farm and to farms around the country to help you get higher yields. And like Darren said a little earlier, one of the most important things is to focus on return on investment, especially when commodity prices are down a little bit. So this is the big question. All right, we don't have $7 corn anymore. Now what do I need to do? We don't have $15 beans anymore. Now what do I need to do to make sure I'm still getting good yield, but I'm also making some good money?
Well, there are a lot more lessons that we can learn, and that's why we're doing a review of our field day. But first, we have to control the weeds. Weeds like our weed of the week. Can you identify this week's weed?